Water pollution. Why do you think it matters that we talk about water pollution?
Well, we're already using our water sources unsustainably, so if we're going to pollute them further and further reduce the amount of water that we have available, we're just going to quicken the process.
So water pollution is going to make our water resources even less sustainable. Absolutely. How long can you live without water? 3 days? We think 3? How long do you think you could live comfortably without water? I mean any water. Not just water to drink, water that has done anything for you. Cooked your food, made your coffee, washed your hands, taken a shower. While you're awake even, not while you're asleep. While you're asleep, you can probably make it for like a good however many hours you can stay asleep. While you're awake, how long can you make it without water? Clean water, I should clarify. 12 hours. Cody thinks, does anyone think Cody can go 12 hours without water containing products or usage of water while awake?
I mean, you wouldn't die, but
It wouldn't be comfortable. What would you drink? So 12 hours with no consumption of liquids. While awake?
Yeah.
You will get dehydrated.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly. So you remember that water is abundant, but it's a finite supply, right? We can't just make more. And water is going to be constantly recycled and purified as it moves through the system, is the hope. Water pollution, though, is going to be some sort of a change or contamination that harms the water in one way or another, or makes something that's in the water harmful to us or other organisms. It is a major threat to human health. It spreads disease. Toxic materials cause water pollution. And to think of water pollution as a human problem, or as even mostly a human problem, is very wrong. Because there are so many other organisms whose lives. So you remember the hydrologic cycle from last time? And you remember that water gets purified as it moves through? It gets purified in part by moving through the soils, the sediments. It picks up minerals as it moves through. It deposits toxins. Bacteria and plant roots and things like that will take out some of the contaminants in the water and help to purify it. As it goes from liquid to water vapor, it will also leave behind contaminants. As it goes from water vapor to liquid to droplets back to the earth, there will also be some purification. The ice freezing and melting is also going to remove some level of contaminants. How much fresh water is available on Earth?
Percentage or like
Sure.
like 1%.
A little less, probably, than 1% of what's available. Water is available fresh water.
Does that include, like, is that just surface water, or does that include, like, aquifers?
Less than 2% would include aquifers. It's not much. Do we understand what aquifers are? Does it help to think of aquifers as an underground lake? So a lake is daily sediment as opposed to being an above ground lake? I'm wondering why now the construction now seems larger. They've removed the wood from the hallway so we can hear it all. I know, it's really exciting. think it must smell better for them with more airflow. Carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Dubé taught these cycles in ecology?
Just nitrogen.
Just nitrogen?
Carbon as well. I don't know if we talked about phosphorus.
Yeah, I'll
I don't
remember
know
phosphorus.
This is where I fully admit to being a biogeochemist in part of my background, meaning that like nutrient cycles for me are exciting and interesting. I know it's not true for most people. When my application for grad school came across my advisor's desk, he said he hid it because I wrote that I was interested in the nitrogen cycle. And there were 2 people at Delaware that did work on the nitrogen cycle, and he didn't let the other guy read my application because then I might have 2 labs that wanted me, and that was not okay. So in case you're looking for a field to get into and you think this stuff is interesting, working in nutrient cycling, there is demand, especially for people who can think a little bit outside the box and like the interdisciplinary nature of environmental science. So our carbon cycle, how is this going to relate to water? Carbon cycle is going to be carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. It's fixed by plants. Plants and animals that are eating the plants are using the carbon. They die, they decay, the carbon dioxide goes back into the gas. How does that relate to water? Does it directly relate to water? Or might it indirectly relate to water? So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causes something called the greenhouse effect. What happens when there's too much carbon dioxide? The earth gets warmer. Climate change is going to impact the water cycle. It's going to determine where rainfall patterns shift. Then here's one that you probably don't think about all the time. So our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes into equilibrium with dissolved carbon dioxide in the water. The more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the more carbon dioxide becomes dissolved in the water. What forms when carbon dioxide dissolves into water? Carbonic acid and the bicarbonates are going to change in their levels. And what does that do to the pH of the water? Acidifies it. Now we know that this is happening in the Finger Lakes. They're being acidified in part through acid rain, mostly through acid rain. And what's happening there is that we're seeing shifts of species. Some are dying off, others are doing better. In the ocean, it's not going to be from acid rain that we get ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is going to be linked to increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Why should we worry about ocean acidification as a pollution concern? The corals themselves are made of calcium carbonate. That's going to dissolve when it's exposed to acid. Tasha and Cody, you had geology. How did we tell if something was calcite? Just see if it fizzed. Those of you that are going to take geology next semester, we're going to determine whether or not something is calcium carbonate by putting acid on it. If it is, it bubbles, it dissolves away. So if we increase the acid level of the ocean, we're going to be killing things directly that are calcium carbonate. And it's not just corals, it's other things. It's also going to affect the uptake rates of certain chemical constituents. Magnesium and strontium and things like this are going to be uptaken at different ratios than they otherwise would be. However, there's this brilliant idea that we have, that maybe, just maybe, we can use the ocean for something called carbon sequestration. Have you heard this phrase before? This is the idea that we can bury carbon in the ocean. We can take it from the atmosphere and store it in the ocean without causing ocean acidification. We're going to do this by fertilizing the ocean and increasing the amount of phytoplankton that are alive and bringing in carbon and fixing carbon. And because the ocean is so large, when they die, it won't cause eutrophication. They'll just sink to the bottom of the ocean. This sounds good, doesn't it? There's just one big problem. We have no idea how to effectively fertilize the ocean. There have been a couple ideas. Iron is one of our main limiting nutrients in the ocean. You only need a little bit, but iron is the main limiting nutrient, we believe. Method one that was shot down, and I know the people who came up with this method, so I can be super critical of them. Tasha's heard me talk about this. They thought it would be a really good idea that they were going to tie blocks of iron to the back of research and cruise ships, and that it would dissolve just slightly as they went around the ocean. You might ask, why is this a good idea? Well, we all know that iron filings aren't going to work. So this was their next idea, that the blocks of iron would dissolve very slowly and let off trace amounts of iron. Not surprisingly, this project was turned down for funding. Also, I'm not going to lie when I say that the professors were really interested in how they could get on the cruise ships for a couple months at a time to study whether or not it was working. But there's this new idea, it's not even new, this has been around for 20 years, that this is a way to fix climate change. Because if we can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in biomass at the bottom of the ocean, we're good. So far, we can't make it happen. Nitrogen cycle and phosphorus cycle are things that we alter all the time. When it comes to water pollution, they matter because they're both fertilizers that we use. So here's our nitrogen cycle. This is not the full nitrogen cycle. Sorry, there's a lot of steps missing. If you ever want to know a lot about the steps of the nitrogen cycle, I have an 8-page single-spaced paper I wrote in grad school with about 15 pages of illustrations of the nitrogen cycle. I'll share it. It's only a little incoherent for a while. But I had to write it as part of my qualifying exams. Those of you looking into grad school, master's degree is great. The PhD, partway through, you take qualifying exams. They give you some topics. You get 6 weeks to study. They can ask you anything they want on those topics. One of my questions, because in my program, you got 2 8-hour days of written exam, and then 2 weeks later, a half day of oral exam on the same topics. One of my questions was, describe the nitrogen cycle in detail, all steps known and theorized, also illustrate. The days that you think we're evil. One of my friends, one of her topics was statistics. She went back and she asked for clarification, and she was told, well, statistics that relate to genetics. Mine were things like salt marsh ecology, remote sensing, nitrogen. But you learn a lot about these topics, and they really just want you to say, well, this is everything I know, and I recognize I don't know everything. And they're like, oh, good, you got that, good. If you cry, it's bonus points. I'm not sure for you or for them. If you run out of the room screaming, that's not good. It's a small aside, but that's why Nitrogen Cycle and I are good friends. I spent 6 weeks of my life studying nothing but the nitrogen cycle. Dreaming about the nitrogen cycle even. So, our reservoir for nitrogen is in multiple places. So in the atmosphere is our ultimate reservoir, nitrogen gas. It's then going to be fixed by bacteria, potentially archaea. And it's going to be then made available to plants, who make it available to animals. Nitrogen also gets stored in the bottom of the ocean as things die. And the only way that nitrogen is then going to be brought back up is if it is decayed and the nitrogen gas bubbles up to the surface, although that's going to be a really small amount of nitrogen available. We make nitrogen available because we create nitrogen fertilizer, mostly from fixing nitrogen and for other purposes. We then apply the nitrogen fertilizer on our ground surfaces, and we hope that it goes into the soil, but we know that a lot of it washes out, which causes nitrogen pollution. Phosphorus cycle. It's a little different. The ultimate reservoir for phosphate right now appears to be the deep ocean sediments. So the richest place for phosphates is the deep ocean sediments. We actually harvest that and bring it up to use in phosphate for fertilizers, but on the long-term geological scale, the uplift of the ocean crust onto the top of continents through plate tectonics is what rejuvenates the phosphorus available. Also, the cycles that are in the atmosphere, that are in the soil with things decaying, it becomes readily available again. Now, you don't need much phosphate. Let's see. Our carbon to nitrogen ratio of most living things is about 7 to 1. So you need 7 carbons for every 1 nitrogen approximately. For phosphates, I think it's something like 14 nitrogens to 1 phosphate. So you don't need a much, but you need some. And the reason is because your DNA requires phosphate. Your proteins require a lot of nitrogen, which is why I have a lot of that, and everything requires lots of carbon. So you have lots of carbon. I mentioned that water pollution is a human issue, but it's not really a human issue because we don't live in the water. We utilize the water. But things that have water as their habitat are much more impacted by water pollution than we could ever possibly be. Imagine for a moment you are a fish or a dolphin or a whale or a sea turtle, any of those things. If you don't like those and you want to be an aquatic insect, you can be that too. You spend your entire life living in the water. All of your food is things that are in the water with you. Water is constantly on and in your body tissues. How much more impacted are you going to be by that pollution? And it's not like you can move. I mean, maybe you can swim from one place to another, but maybe you can't get out of the water you're in. Water as a habitat is considered either, our water habitats are either freshwater or marine aquatic ecosystems. Freshwater, no salt. Marine has salt. Estuaries are these areas of intermediate salinity, and then there are some other types of systems in between. And our marine aquatic ecosystems have a salinity of 35. You're going to notice I didn't add a unit there. Salinity itself is actually a unitless measurement. For clarity, we say 35 parts per thousand, but it doesn't have an actual unit because when you actually measure out salinity, the units cancel as you go through the process of calculating salinity. The 35 parts per thousand would be what salinity normally is. An estuary is probably going to fall between, 15 and 28. 1 to 5, we normally consider brackish water. And fresh water is going to have a salinity of 0. And we find our aquatic ecosystems are defined by location and by property. So we have those that are freshwater versus saltwater. But also, are you talking about upper waters that are light-filled? Deep waters that are dark? Normally, our upper level in the water column is going to be warmer, and the amount of, or the temperature difference at the bottom is going to be a lot colder. So we think of light and temperature and dissolved oxygen decreasing with depth. Having said that, dissolved oxygen does increase at some points deeper in the ocean than it does other places. I don't think we'll get there in this class. We do in marine bio. And then our habitat includes producers, consumers, and decomposers. One of the strangest things I remember learning about the ocean is that it's one of the only places in the world where viruses count as food. That there are bacteria that eat viruses. This is showing you the concept of an aquatic marine ecosystem. We have the continental shelf, and above it is kind of our coastal zone. This is where you have things that are growing on the bottom that are interacting with the things in the water column. Our euphotic zone is going to be the area where there is light available. The bathyl zone, I don't even know that I would agree with it being twilight. It's mostly dark to almost entirely dark. This is going to be your deeper areas, but not the bottom. The bottom of the ocean is going to be the abyssal zone, where you're in contact with the mid-Atlantic ridges and the very deepest parts of the ocean. The red line is showing you temperature. I think. Yes, temperature. It equally also could be showing you sunlight, but the scale is temperature. No, I'm not going to go there. It's not on there. And I'm going to change something that you heard most of your life. There are 5 oceans. There are not 4. Does this like destroy anybody's worldview with 5 oceans? So you know 4 of them: Pacific, Atlantic, Arctic, and Indian. Are you familiar with the Southern Ocean? This goes around Antarctica, sometimes called the Antarctic Ocean. The Southern Ocean is considered a distinct ocean by oceanographers and marine biologists because it has very different properties than the rest of the water in the world, and also because it does go around. It flows around Antarctica. So it is a separate pattern system to what we see in the other 4 oceans. The Arctic Ocean this year has had a pretty interesting year. Hasn't frozen much. Definitely did not freeze all the way over. The Southern Ocean and the Arctic Ocean are at opposite seasons, keep in mind. So they do have different processes that happen there. And the Arctic Ocean includes the whole pole, whereas the Southern Ocean does not because Antarctica is down there. Our 3 zones of our ocean are the coastal zone, which is usually within about 200 miles or less of the coast. Our open sea, which is obvious, and then the benthos, or the ocean bottom. The things that are benthic organisms are going to be those that live on the bottom. Oh, wow. That's not good. That's a little better. This is the Mississippi River Delta, the Mississippi Estuary. What do you see in this picture? What do you see coming away from the river?
Is that sediment or is it like land? Is
Some of
there
it is
land
sediment.
there?
Yeah, there is land, and there's areas where it's building land. What a green color.
Brackish.
This is going to be an area where there is some brackish water because you have this mixing of this fresh water and the salt water coming in. This area is really productive, meaning that there's a lot of biological life here because you're bringing in all the nutrients, all the nitrogen, all the phosphorus from the entire Mississippi River, and you're bringing it out here. So it's very productive water. We actually have this nutrient-rich, sediment-filled water dumping out into the ocean. The green is an algae bloom or an algal bloom. That in and of itself isn't a bad thing because there's lots of shrimp and other things here that are then going to eat the algae. When it gets too large is when it becomes a problem. We get every year now in the Gulf of Mexico an area called a dead zone that is in part related to this algal bloom. The dead zone is the area where there is almost no dissolved oxygen in the water. The waters become anoxic, A-N-O-X-I-C, meaning that they have no water or no oxygen, or they become hypoxic, H-Y-P-O-X-I-C, where they have very little oxygen. This is because as those algal blooms die and sink, the bacteria that eat them up also utilize all of the oxygen in the water. What do you think the problems are of the dead zones?
The fish are
The fish and the other organisms living there are going to die. They don't have any oxygen. Absolutely. Which decreases the fish yield and the shellfish yield and things like that. It affects the fishermen. It affects the other organisms that find their food in that area, and it's a problem. Related back to water pollution. Anyone know what these ecosystems are?
It's mangrove swamp, right?
Mangroves and a salt marsh. These are going to be coastal marine habitats. They're going to be very easily impacted by human activity because they are right where we are. When you have greater than 60% of the people living within 100 miles of the coast, the impact on coastal ecosystems is huge. How about this? Coral reef system. These are also going to be coastal ecosystems, easily impacted by people. These are very complex systems with a large variety of organisms, each playing important roles. And this one? Also a coral reef. This one's in the Red Sea. You can see that there's soft corals here as well as the whole. Our freshwater aquatic systems are probably ones you're more familiar with. We have the way that we classify a standing body of water, like a lake or a pond, is usually by its amount of nutrient available. A eutrophic lake has high levels of nutrients. An oligotrophic lake has low levels of nutrients. The top picture is an oligotrophic lake. It's clear water, which indicates relatively low quantities of nutrients and low bioactivity, low bioproductivity. The eutrophic lakes would be like the picture you see here at the bottom, with high levels of standing biotic activity, high levels of nutrients, and the water tends not to be clear. When we think of eutrophication, we think of overloading of nitrogen and phosphorus, which leads to algal blooms, which when they die, use up all the oxygen. But I had a professor explain them in a very different way once, that the concept of eutrophication is increased or advanced aging of an aquatic system. Because what happens is that a eutrophic system, as things start to die and they settle out, it starts to get higher levels of siltation. The sediment starts getting higher, and it's going to fill in faster than an oligotrophic lake would, even if the sediment really is all of the dead algae and things like that. That the system itself doesn't last as long because our processes are turning it away from a pond into more of a wetlandish area and eventually into land. And it was kind of scary to think of eutrophication as that type of a process. What are types of flowing freshwater systems? What might we call them? A river, a stream, a creek, or a crick, depending upon how you want to pronounce it. A run. And we talked in chapter 10 about drainage. We talked about source zone, transition zone, and floodplain. We didn't talk about a watershed or a drainage basin, though. Watershed and drainage basin are used interchangeably. They deal with all of the land area that drains into a specific water body. So where does all of the runoff, what land does the runoff all come from? Does anyone know what watershed we're in right here? Gulf Creek, right?
On a small scale, yeah.
On a small scale, large scale,
Like the Delaware River.
Delaware River or Delaware Bay. How about Lancaster? What's its small-ish to medium scale? Susquehanna, yeah, which goes into Chesapeake Bay. If I wanted to go smaller than Susquehanna, I would go with the Conestoga even. Right? Yeah. Yeah. At least at Millersville it was, because it was right next to campus. So we can look at small scales of watershed or large scale. And wetlands we'll do later in the semester. This is an area that at some point in the year usually has standing water or has wetland soils or has wetland plants or some combination thereof. We will do a lab where you're outside and you're going to determine what areas of campus are wetlands and which ones are not. But I wanted to wait until there was no chance of snow and we would have better weather. So we're doing that in April. This is showing you again the source zone. Anyone want to name our ecosystems we have here? The cypress swamp. Very good. Your textbook apparently only thought it was an algae swamp. It is a cypress swamp. They're wrong. In South Carolina. And then the other pictures from the Everglades where you have the cattails and my ornithology people. What's that bird? What?
Snowy egret.
It's an egret. Snowy egret. Very good. Cody, were you right? Did you say it was a herring, Cody?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, Cody. So, this is a short list of how humans, this is how we impact aquatic habitats just by looking at how we impact the water cycle. We take fresh water from lakes, from streams, and from aquifers, usually at a faster rate than it can recharge itself. That's going to decrease the amount of water available to the organisms in aquatic ecosystems. We clear the land and we make it impermeable to water, which means that runoff rates are faster, infiltration rates are less, recharge rates are slower, and we've removed the natural ability of the land to suck up water. We're also increasing then the chances of pollutants running off, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. Since 1950, human activities have more than doubled the amount of nitrogen that is entering ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, through our actions. We expect that it will have doubled again by 2020. At one point in time, we used to say that the ocean was nitrogen limited and that freshwater systems were phosphorus limited, and that's just the way it was. That's no longer true because we're altering the cycles dramatically. We're also draining and filling our wetlands, which decreases the water available because we're taking a wetland and we're making it into another ecosystem type. Like, we're building buildings, I'm not going to name any, but we build them on wetlands. And if ever we build more things on campus, well, I think President Matthews might listen to me, so I will go and yell if we build on the wetlands. And I'll take you all with me. And climate change isn't up here, but it's another human impact. It's affecting droughts, floods, and ocean acidity. Oh no. So these are major categories. Sediment. You might not think about sediment as a major category of pollution, but it is, especially with construction. Inorganic nutrients are nitrogen, are phosphorus, which brings up eutrophication. Thermal pollution are disease-producing microorganisms. And when we go to our wastewater treatment plant tour in a couple weeks, that's going to be one of the places where we learn a lot about disease-producing microorganisms. Toxic organic chemicals, heavy metals, and then oxygen-demanding waste, which is also something we'll talk about on our wastewater treatment tour. And while we're there, if any of you are thinking about pursuing a career in wastewater, he loves to talk about like how you can get started in that. Because there's going to be a lot of wastewater operators retiring in the next 10 years. So there's going to be massive demand for people filling those. Sediment pollution. How many of you thought of this as a pollution type before I mentioned it? This is what I'm familiar with because when I was between my freshman and my sophomore years of college, I did an internship with the Delaware County Conservation District. If you live in Delaware County, they do offer internships. You can talk to me about that because I think the guy who's there was actually my supervisor when I was there. And Delaware County, well, we don't have a lot of land left to conserve because we've kind of developed a lot of it. But one of the things that I did is I went on site inspections for construction sites to see whether or not they were adhering to the rules regarding sediment pollution, because they're not allowed to let sediment leave their area. They're supposed to do everything in their power to keep the sediment on their area. Because as sediment runs into aquatic ecosystems, it is going to get caught in the gills of fish. But really what it's going to do is shade out the system, which is going to decrease photosynthesis, decreasing the amount of food available in the system. And that's bad. So sediment pollution is when your sand, your silt, and really your clay, these inorganic soil particles, where it's the literal breakdown of rock particles, become suspended in water. Sand settles out quickly. It's large. Silt settles out next. But clay may never really settle out. They're very small particles. There is natural sediment pollution from stream bank erosion or from land erosion. During really large rainstorms, you'll see that new gullies will form as water runs off of areas. But a lot of it is human-based today. From farmland, where we're tilling the soil too much. From construction sites we don't manage properly. And the soils, they carry other pollutants along with them, especially the clays. They're very absorbent. I mentioned they block out sunlight. We have linked sediment pollution to destruction of breeding grounds of fish and shellfish, where it actually smothers the eggs and the developing organisms. Anybody want to drink silty water? Not at all. Contaminates drinking water. It threatens reservoirs because you have to get that silt out. It builds up and it decreases the storage volume of your reservoir. We treat this in a number of ways. One is the sediment fencing that they put around a construction site. That orange or black or sometimes green fencing that looks like material. As the water from like a flooding rainstorm pushes against it, the water goes through, but the sediment stays behind. It acts like a net. You've probably also noticed if you've driven through a new construction site in the last like 15 years of houses that have been built, even 20 years, they have these ponds strategically placed throughout the developments. It's not because those were ponds. It's because as they're building, they have to have a pond that's a water retention basin where all of the water is sent towards it. You've also probably noticed they have these areas that are these nice little sweeping areas of grass that have a little valley in them. They're called swales. All of the swales must direct to the drainage basins so that the sediment settles out and it doesn't contaminate the nearby water systems. And then all of the gravel, did I mention this before? The gravel that's at a construction entrance, what it does? Knocks your sediment off too. So we can control sediment pollution. We just have to enforce it. Inorganic nutrient pollution is harder. Nitrate and phosphates. Okay, well, fertilizers. We put it on the ground, it rains, they wash away. Sure. But not just farms, golf courses, lawns. Then there's domestic sewage and septic tanks. If our sewage goes directly into the reservoir, it takes our nitrogen waste with it. Anybody have a septic tank? Does it leak? Hopefully not. Do they leak? Yes. As they do, it doesn't do its job because instead of everything breaking down and just the water being released, all of that nitrogen-rich human waste is released too. We have our livestock waste from our confined animal feeding operations. Oh man, you've got all these animals in a very small area. That's a whole lot of manure. There have been many times where hurricane flooding in an area has taken all of that manure into a body of water. It contaminates it not just with nitrogen waste, but also with bacteria. Domestic pets and their desire to go outside and our desire to have them go outside, walking your dog, poops and pees, we expect that urban runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus has been increased by 5 parts per million based on our domestic pets like dogs. I mentioned that nitrogen and phosphorus used to be limiting factors, and they're not. Okay, so this is where we left off last time because I mistakenly called the substance the wrong name, and I decided we were done. Eutrophic algal blooms. These don't just happen in lakes, even though the word lake is up there. They can happen in any body of water. They happen in estuaries. They tend not to happen in fast-flowing areas of water because in fast-flowing water, you never get a really large buildup of anything because everything is constantly flushed through the system. So your main algal blooms are going to develop in still bodies of water. The first thing that we didn't like about them is, well, they look bad. Think about it. Who wants to go in water that has a nice, thick layer of green goo on the top? Anybody? We got 2. How many of you think they're lying? Just a little. Secondly, the water gets a bad odor and a bad taste because these blooming algal species, and we call them a bloom because they appear in these massive numbers and it seems to happen almost out of nowhere, just kind of like spring flowers blooming. They can give off some pretty nasty chemicals. They decompose, and as they do, they use up oxygen, and they give off hydrogen sulfide gas, which is bad enough. But then some of them create poisonous and toxic chemicals. Some of them create neurotoxic chemicals when they hit bloom status. One of the things we don't understand is how that these algae species can be in the water at all times and not go into blooms. But when they go into blooms, why they suddenly start producing the toxic chemicals. We're not sure if they produce it to kind of fight off ones of their own species. We don't think they do because they don't seem to be self-toxic. But one of the reasons we think they do it is because that it allows them to kill other things that are in the water to be able to release more nutrients for them to use. Because the bloom itself starts to die when they run out of nutrients. So we think that when they hit a certain population size, it turns on these creation of toxic chemicals. What the process is, we don't know, because these are single-celled creatures. If it was a multicellular organism, we could understand how it works, but single-celled creatures deciding that at a certain population level we all go toxic? Strange. What kinds of toxic? Well, fish die outright from them often. You are unlikely to die from these chemicals. If you're exposed to them, you will develop a rash. You may have breathing problems. You may get ill. There's also neurological symptoms that humans get because of them, because some of them are neurotoxins. There was a lab, I think it was at the University of Maryland, where the researchers, the grad students, were working on them, and some of them were exposed to the neurotoxins of the organisms they were working on. It did lead to higher than normal incidences of anxiety and depression and other neurological symptoms in the grad students. And some of the people did not end up finishing the project. As far as we're aware, it didn't lead to any permanent nerve damage. But is it strange to think of algae making you sick? Aside from that, it shades out the bottom plants. When you have that green goo all over the top, no sunlight's making it through to the bottom. And in a lot of lakes and in a lot of estuaries, you have what's called submerged aquatic vegetation. This is rooted vegetation living on the bottom in the sediments. It needs sunlight to move through the water column in order to do its photosynthesis. Eventually, these species, as they live and they die and they decay, it destroys the oxygen content of the water, and then other things may die from having decreased oxygen. And as the things die, things pile up on the bottom, and we get that concept of that increased aging from eutrophication, because the water body becomes that much more shallow. And I mentioned streams don't have this problem because they're fast flowing. And I have no idea how much noise we're going to get from the hallway because they were putting up the ladder outside of my office door. Sorry. Thermal pollution. You were right. And I like this graphic. This picture here. Do you see that nice bright white plume? In thermal imagery, things that are warm, in black and white thermal imagery, things that are warm are white. Things that are cold are black. This was taken in the winter. The black area is the water body. Where this bright white area comes out in that like line is an effluent pipe coming from a power plant. That water is much warmer than the surrounding water. And you can see that plume, P-L-U-M-E, of water that is produced as the water moves from a singular pipe as it spreads out into the water body. Thermal pollution is a problem. It increases the water temperature of these areas. And it can, in fact, increase the water temperature significantly. Why does this matter? Warm water contains less dissolved oxygen and can hold less dissolved oxygen than can cold water. So when then things become thermally stressed, they can also become stressed for oxygen because there's not enough oxygen in the water body. Hot water, we know, disrupts fish migration patterns and migration timing because they sense the temperature change in the water and they think it means something it doesn't. We believe it also can affect the patterns of mating and growth of other types of organisms, where they look at the seasonality changes in water temperature as a cue. Indirectly, thermal pollution increases the susceptibility to diseases of all of the organisms living in the water body, because diseases spread faster at warmer temperatures, and disease-causing organisms are less likely to die in these areas of slightly warmer than normal temperatures. It can directly kill things. If it gets too hot, it could literally cook them to death. It also does something kind of strange that we hadn't considered at first. It facilitates the invasions of warm water species moving up bays and rivers and estuaries. As they move upstream into colder areas, they're able to use these as like refuge points or stopover places. So they move up, and then maybe in the winter they can't move away from where this thermal plume is, but they can constantly live where the thermal plume is. No one expected that this would allow for invasive species to move easily. We find that it alters algal communities. It switches things from our normal eukaryotic green, red, and brown algae towards cyanobacteria as your prime type of algal species. And then one that's a little weird is wherever you have a thermal pollution coming out, they're also pulling water in. There have been many cases of direct death of animals from being pulled in to the water plants. In Biscayne Bay in the 1970s, this was one of the first times we realized thermal pollution was a large problem, because there was a 75-acre area of the bay that was a dead zone due to decreased oxygen in the water and too high of temperature. Things are floating on the surface of the water dead. You take note of that. And it's, okay, what is the pollution we're dealing with here? Oh, thermal pollution. It's a new idea. There are natural causes. Summer causes water to heat up. Sunlight causes water to heat up. So there's some level of thermal change that is natural. But then, as we utilize water for cooling our power plants and then discharge it back while it is still warm, it causes thermal pollution. There is an upside to thermal pollution. In the winter, in very, very cold winters, it allows species to thrive where they might not be able to. We find that manatees and seals and sea otters and things like that in the winter will congregate around these outflows of thermal pollution, because it gives them an area where there should be a lot of food and warm enough temperatures to survive. When we find manatees and seals up in this area, frequently they're found near thermal pollution zones, especially the manatees. They like to get lost in New Jersey, and they end up at wastewater treatment plants and at cooling towers because they like the warmer water. Wastewater treatment plants also tend to discharge in the winter warmer water than there is in the rivers themselves. But that's because as the water is going through the plant, it is warming compared to what it is in nature. But it's not as massive as a power plant. And then we have disease-producing microorganisms. These are the things that make you sick. Give me an example of a disease-producing microorganism. What makes you sick?
Bacteria.
Salmonella, bacteria. Why do you wash your hands after you've been touching raw chicken? Any raw meat, why do you wash your hands?
Parasites.
Because it could be all
I hope there's no parasites.
All the bacteria.
All the bacteria in your hands. What happens if you are playing with raw chicken and then you go and eat your sandwich without washing your hands?
Bacteria.
Do you think you're going to get food poisoning? Pretty high. Anyone have a pet turtle? You had to wash your hands after you played with the pet turtle, right? Oh. But Do you know that with a pet turtle, you have to wash your hands after? Turtles can give humans salmonella on a fairly regular basis. I think at one point in time I heard, I don't know if this is true, but I heard that turtles carry a higher risk of you contracting salmonella if the turtle has it on their skin and shell than chicken, raw chicken, which is terrifying. And Micro, what are you guys playing with right now? E. coli? Can that make us sick? You better be Lysoling those benches for us. Please. Don't worry, Sarah also cleans them on Wednesdays. And 324, not in this room. Thank God. We wouldn't be able to eat lunch in here if we play with microorganisms. So water becomes polluted by microorganisms, normally because of human and animal waste. Disease-producing microorganisms in water are responsible for more causes of human illness worldwide than any other environmental factor. Isn't that terrifying? We expect that approximately 1 million Americans become sick every year due to disease-producing organisms in water. About 900 to 1,000 Americans will die in a year from disease-producing microorganisms. And we have good water treatment plants here. What types of things? Bacteria, viruses, protozoas. So what happens is you drink, swim, or bathe in water that contains these disease-producing organisms. Maybe it's because of human sewage being discharged into an area. Maybe it's because, at a lot of animal feeding, concentrated animal feeding lots, or even a lot of animal farming areas, you find these small ponds that are usually brownish in color. You should never swim in one. They are manure retention ponds, so they push all of the manure into them to hold it. It's a retaining pond, so that it doesn't all wash away and wash down into the local water bodies when it rains. So it's contained in these areas. But then when you have a massive storm that comes and drops like 2.5 inches of rain, those might overflow. And then there's a whole lot of pollution going straight into the water. A hurricane, something like that. Or if it's something where they have built a pool around it and the side breaks out, it all goes. And manure contains bacteria, breeding ground for bacteria. There's a lot of food for it there. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, polio, and hepatitis can all be spread through contaminated water. Pfiesteria is an algal species. It's a dinoflagellate. It is one that can create those algal blooms that I just mentioned. That is found as a disease-producing organism here. It affects fish, and it does kill the fish. It doesn't infect them. And the fish are not a way of getting to the fish and then infecting us. It has to affect us also directly. The fish get open sores. They get lesions all over their bodies when they're exposed to high levels of Pfiesteria, because Pfiesteria releases toxins. We get sick from Pfiesteria. It can cause sores. It can cause rashes. It may potentially cause neurological symptoms. That's unclear whether or not those have been caused by Pfiesteria. There's been a few cases. We believe what allows Pfiesteria to bloom are times of really warm water and high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. So thermal pollution mixed with fertilizer pollution in the right area, in the right conditions, can lead to a Pfiesteria bloom. But they don't always. There's something else in there that also affects it. Because in areas where Pfiesteria is common and where some of the other algal blooms are common, we have sensors that are in bodies of water that constantly measure water temperature and nitrogen and phosphorus and pH levels and things like that. And then they trigger people when things hit a certain level to go out and take samples so that we can sample the water to see if those organisms are there. Big surprise. Sometimes they're not, and we don't know why. And then sometimes they are. And sometimes they're there in a low level and everything's fine. And sometimes they're there in a high level and things start to die. And we don't know what controls it. How do you think you get rid of Pfiesteria or these algal blooming species if you work with them in the lab? What do you think the protocol is? Because you can't just dump them down the drain, right? You could. If they're a saltwater species, you could in fact dump them down the drain with a lot of fresh water. It's not ideal. But what do you think you do?
Freeze them.
Nope. Good idea. The opposite.
More heat.
We microwave them.
Nice.
The lab that was at Delaware that worked on these, they had a microwave and it was like for algae only. Like there was like big, like do not microwave your food in here. And the protocol was to microwave them for 4 minutes. Because they'd done a study and at like 90 seconds, everything's dead. But they figured like for overkill, they would go for 4 minutes. And then you pour it down the drain. Yeah, but it's a really great way to get rid of it. So in case you were like, this sounds really horrible, how can we possibly work on it? Well, we kill it all when we're done. The toxic organic compounds, they contain carbon, obviously. They're organic. Mostly we focus on the synthetic ones, the ones that we have in fact made by our processes. Synthetic compounds are not going to decompose by natural methods normally. Bacteria, sun, air, and water are not necessarily going to break them down. DDT, PCBs, and plasticizers. The plasticizers are things like bisphenol A, which you've probably heard about because if you buy a water bottle, I'm certain, look to make sure it says it's BPA free, the bisphenol A. The phthalates, the PTHALATES, if you look at a lot of skincare items anymore, that's one of the ones that they're saying they're all free of because phthalates are a toxic organic compound in some ways. Some of these things we use directly in factories and they get released directly from factories in waste. But a lot of times some of these things are used in either making our drugs and they pass through us and we excrete them as waste, or they're used in solvents that are somehow released down the drain. A lot of them are used in pesticides. More of them are used in synthetic fibers and plastic bottles that become trash in our bodies of water and dissolved. We measure toxicity by looking at the ability to disrupt normal enzyme function. And we have determined toxicity levels for a lot of these things. There are usually 2 levels of toxicity listed for these chemicals. One is the level at which it kills 50% of the organisms. The other is the level where it kills 100%. You've heard the LD50s? Yeah. So LD50 is a lethal dose that kills 50%, and LD100 kills 100%. And we usually do develop these because that way we can set a safety standard that is somewhere well below the LD50. At one point in time in the 1900s, we just released chemicals directly to the water because we had a saying that dilution is the solution to pollution. I have diluted water. I put it in an area of more water. My pollutant is now dilute enough that it's not a problem. Does this strike you as an issue? Why?
Water currents make it concentrate in one area.
Sometimes it's going to become concentrated in one area. The water currents are going to keep it perhaps right there. Why else?
Sometimes small amounts are still bad.
Sometimes small amounts are still bad. What's the matter? Go ahead.
People are gonna keep dumping more in.
Yeah. So if I have a glass of water and I add like 3 drops of food coloring to it, it's somewhat colorful. What if I had like 100 drops? Because we keep putting it back in, putting it in, putting it in. And if we're diluting it because we know we can't store it and we know it's not good, over a long period of time, we're actually concentrating it by continuously putting it into the system. So we know we can't do this anymore. So some things we try to treat, but we can't treat everything. Our wastewater treatment plants lack the ability to remove a lot of chemicals. Here's some examples of things they can't remove. Caffeine, antidepressants, antibiotics, anti-anxiety meds, antipsychotics, birth control meds. None of those things can be removed through any of the processes that a wastewater treatment plant does. Now, those things aren't toxic organic compounds for the most part. They're organic compounds, but they're not toxic to us. So we are trying to develop new ways that we can try to make things that will break down on their own. Or we're making industries recycle their wastewater and continuously use it. And some of them have decreased the amount of wastewater they produce by having in-house wastewater treatment facilities that can treat things a little better than the way ours do. One of the things that we do to get rid of these toxic organic compounds is called deep well injection. In this, you inject the wastewater deep into the earth, well below the aquifers that you believe people will pull water from, well below them. And the idea is that the water will be trapped there indefinitely, which from our last chapter is bad because that reduces the amount of water available for people. What do we deep well inject? Arsenic, cyanide, which is where I was coming up with this the other day, radioactive material. We inject them into areas where we expect that they'll be trapped for at least 10,000 years. Yes, in some places there have been contaminations of surface waters or of aquifers above that area. And yes, it has led to an increase in earthquakes in some areas, but we don't have a better way to do this, so this is what we do. There's virtually no mechanisms to clean groundwater once it has become contaminated. The sediments and the bacteria in the ground may be able to clean some of it, but what happens is that it spreads from that area and you can't contain it. It spreads through the entire aquifer. One of the other things that leads to toxic organic compound waste is leaking gasoline storage tanks, because gasoline is stored underground at gas stations. If they rupture and leak, it contaminates all of the groundwater in an area, which in turn can contaminate your drinking water or stream water as the groundwater then enters back into surface water. Unfortunately, water is rarely polluted by just one contaminant. Usually our water is polluted by multiple contaminants. Are you familiar with the idea of a synergistic effect? You probably are. You're probably just not familiar with the word. It's the idea that, let's say you have three things. If we add those three things together, the actual impact is way worse than just summing them up. That there's some sort of a multiplier in this. That if chemicals A, B, and C cause these problems, they're only going to cause those problems. It's, oh no, then they're going to cause other problems that are there because of the interactions. So these synergistic effects are interaction issues. We know that contaminated groundwater and contaminated surface water are linked to health issues, but that linkage is unclear. We can't always say this causes this, because it doesn't always. And we know that a lot of these wastes are still illegally disposed of, but in the United States, it's not an issue. Very little of this waste is illegally disposed of here. But worldwide, toxic organic compounds are a massive. This one I'm briefly going to mention, because I don't want to spend long on it, because it's a little gross. Oxygen-demanding organic waste. Poop. Fecal matter. Why do we call it oxygen demanding organic waste? Because as it breaks down, the bacteria breaking it down use a lot of oxygen. We measure this in wastewater treatment because we want to be sure that we're not putting water that contains too much material that's oxygen demanding waste back into our natural water systems, because if we do, we're going to decrease the oxygen available to the system. The way that we do that is we measure the biochemical oxygen demand, or the BOD, of the water. Because we cannot measure the organic content well, we measure the biochemical oxygen demand. So the activity of the bacteria to break things down. If something has high BOD, it's going to have low levels of dissolved oxygen. And then what you guys were getting at for the pharmaceuticals. This is part of it. We have hormone disruptors and drugs and pharmaceuticals. Hormone disruptors are literally what they sound like. They alter hormone systems. They affect reproductive systems. Okay, well, this is where I'm going to say, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use birth control. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying we need to be aware of the issues that it can cause. In the Great Lakes, male fish have developed both male and female reproductive organs. They've become hermaphrodites. In some of these species of fish, the males are now incapable of reproducing. So you have a small subset of the male population that's capable of reproducing and a lot that are not, because they've been feminized through the use of chemicals in the water. Chemicals that they're not choosing to take themselves, but that are there, that they are bathed in constantly. Some of those are birth controls. Some of them are not. Pulp mills, wood pulp mills, release estrogen-like compounds. So it's also some plastic breakdown products and things like that can have effects on hormone levels. From the pulp mills, we have found that male cod start to produce egg yolk proteins in their bodies. Would male fish need to make egg yolk? No, they don't produce eggs. So it is affecting their bodies by making them produce egg yolk proteins. What we have found is that the males that do this are usually closer to shore than the ones that don't. Because as you go further away from the source, there's a decrease in the impact. But we do know that this can travel miles offshore, downstream, things like that. In the cod, they found that the older male cod actually produce higher levels of egg yolk protein than do the younger ones, which we believe is linked to the fact that they have accumulated so much of this hormone throughout their lifetime. Birth control pills, like every medication that you take, contain far more active medication than your body will ever use. Let's say I don't even know what percentage it is, but it could be at times over 50% of the medication in a pill that you take, regardless of what type of pill it is, passes through your body. Your body never breaks it down, never utilizes it. You know, in chemistry lab, every so often somebody would be like, oh my gosh, I didn't add quite enough of a reagent. And your professor goes, don't worry, we add it in excess, it'll be fine. That's what we do with pharmaceuticals. So they pass through our bodies and they go straight into the system. They're excreted in our urine and they go into the wastewater. We have linked human use of birth control pills to gender shifts in male carp and walleye. And we have found that it not only changes gender, but it leads to sterility in the males. And that can lead to collapse of a population over a long period of time. But worse perhaps than birth control pills are the birth control patches, because at one point in time the instructions said to, when you're done, flush it down the toilet. where people just assumed that they could flush them down the toilet. It contains a lot of extra medication. The patches work like the stopping cigarette smoking. You just put it on your skin and it goes directly into your body. So it contains massive amounts that you will never utilize. It also contains adhesives and other chemicals that will become dissolved. We have been finding antibiotics, painkillers, blood pressure meds, antidepressants, caffeine, hormones in our water systems since the 1970s at detectable levels. The levels are all relatively low, but they're there. This is Daphnia. Daphnia is a tiny, tiny little crustacean. They're cute. I like them. We have found that Daphnia respond to some of these chemicals in a strange way. When exposed to cholesterol-lowering medications and antidepressants at the same time, in the lab, some were found to die within 6 days. High levels of antidepressants and cholesterol-lowering medications caused them to die within 6 days. Reduced levels of the medications led to physical deformalities. Daphnia are usually the base of the food web. They're in the zooplankton that eats the phytoplankton that are then eaten by everything else. Antibiotics, shockingly, more than birth control, causes a switch in gender in Daphnia populations. What do you think happens to them? It goes male. Why antibiotics would make a switch in a population from female to male, we don't know, but it happens. These are considered emerging pollutants. These are pollutants that we've been concerned about since the 1970s, but we haven't really figured out how to handle well, in part because most of the research on them has happened in your lifetime. One of the things that companies have been lobbied about is changing the way. And now we're going to switch to something you can fix. What's going on here?
Is that oil?
Might be some oil in there. Anyone gonna go swimming in here? Not even Matt. So there's some oil in there. There's a lot of trash in there. Some decomposing plastic bags in there. This we can fix, can't we? %50 of our world's rivers are heavily polluted. It doesn't mean that we can't fix quite a bit of it, though. In China, 1/3 of the Chinese rivers cannot be used for irrigation water. Some of them are almost considered too toxic to be in. But 2/3 of their water is polluted. In South America and Africa, they tend to have a little bit less of the heavily polluted from the things that we deal with pollution, but they tend to have a little bit more sewage pollution. And their industrial areas are having more pollution than their rural areas. A lot of the pollution is untreated sewage, but more of it perhaps could be industrial waste. MDCs have more laws to control pollution, and they usually require wastewater treatment. Non-degradable heavy metals, toxic chemicals. They kill not only the fish and us, potentially, but they really harm human health. Algal blooms and fish kills are all there. The EPA said, I guess it was about 5 years ago, that about 1/3 of our medium to large lakes and 85% of lakes near human cities have cultural eutrophication, where they're seeing nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. And then we have trash as a big problem. Because trash gets stuck and it breaks down into smaller things and it releases chemicals. But streams can clean themselves out if they're not overloaded, because the water is constantly pushing downstream, which means the places that we're going to deal with a lot of pollution are your lakes, your ponds, your estuaries, and the ocean. which brings us to the fastest I'm ever going to cover ocean pollution. 50% of people live near the ocean, 40% of the world lives near the ocean. In most of your less developed nations, they discharge almost all of their sewage directly to the ocean. We tend to not. We usually treat it. But oceans have long been viewed as a dumping ground because no one owned them, no one needed to take care of them. And the ocean is really deep, so the trash is just going to sink to the bottom and it's all going to be okay. Sometimes I think that the way that we handled pollution used to be the same way that like a 3-year-old handles things. Like if I forget about it, it's fine. If I don't look at it, it's not there. Because I think that's what we did. Oh gosh. The New York Bight is a shallow area out of the New York Bay. And bight is this weird word we use for currents. It was an area where raw sewage was frequently dumped from New York City and from New Jersey. There was a blanket of pollution that covered over 40 square miles. It led to low dissolved oxygen. Fish living there developed something called black gill disease. It was pretty obvious because their gills turned black. Similar to our lungs turning black, I assume. Fish there had such high levels of toxic metals that nobody could eat them. And there were mutations in the fish, and all of the shellfish was contaminated. Suddenly we realized, wait a minute, we can't keep dumping pollution in the ocean. So in 1988, the Ocean Dumping Act banned all ocean garbage dumping by the United States into the ocean by 1992. Does it surprise you that it wasn't until 1992 that we dumped, or that we banned dumping into the ocean? Really? It's a terrible thought. Dredge spoils are still allowed to be dumped there. Dredge spoils are when you pull up the bottom sediments to deepen a channel. We assume we can still dump them because they came from the ocean. I just mentioned what dredge spoils were. Plastic pollution. 100 million tons, 10 million tons of plastic go into the ocean every year. How do we fix that? Recycling. Reduction of plastic waste. And then my favorite is the fact that we have companies, plastic companies, and we have food companies that are like, this is not okay. They are developing biodegradable and photodegradable plastic. Biodegradable plastics are frequently made from corn and sugarcane and other types of plant matter, where it's not plastic. It has the consistency of plastic, but it is biodegradable. Photodegradable means light can break it down. And this is what we're trying to do, especially in plastic that end up in the ocean, because there's a lot of sunlight in the ocean. If the plastics can break down easily, we're going to have less animals dying every year from plastics. But there's one problem. A lot of them, as they break down, release toxic chemicals. And then we have oil pollution, which if you want to talk a lot about, you should ask Cody or Tasha. Both of them wrote a paper last year on oil pollution, marine bio. The most important thing you need to know about oil pollution is that those horrible scenes that you see of like Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon breakage, they produce less oil pollution on average than do the natural sources. I'm sorry, not natural sources. The leaks that happen from boats and things and us pouring oil down the drain every single day. There are natural sources of oil pollution where there are seeps where it comes out, but they're very small. Tanker spills are 5% of the oil pollution. But when they happen, they're bad because Exxon Valdez dumped 11 million gallons on the coastline of Alaska at the height of seal and bird breeding and migration time period. And when it happened, it was considered so tragic because of where and when it happened. I'm coming back for a couple things that I missed last time around. So we did talk about algal blooms already. But did you know that harmful algal blooms are a top cause of why beaches are closed in the summers? One of the top causes. And that harmful algal blooms are responsible for at least 60,000 cases of food poisoning a year. When humans get food poisoning from shellfish, frequently harmful algal blooms are to blame. I had a friend in grad school who was only allergic to oysters from the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays. When she ate oysters that were harvested on the west coast of the United States, she had no problems. But there was an algal species that contaminated them on the east coast that she was allergic to. And she thought it was really weird. Oh, excuse me, I'd like to order your oysters. Where are they from? And we know that nutrients are a major cause, but they're not the only cause of why harmful algal blooms happen. The oxygen depleted zones are sometimes called dead zones because there's so little oxygen, nothing can really survive there. And that's due to the bacterial decomposition of other living matter, reducing the oxygen in the water. The Gulf of Mexico has a large dead zone, but the biggest dead zone in any normal body of water is in the Baltic Sea, which is in Europe. And that has the largest normal dead zone every year. This is showing you what the dead zone looks like in the Gulf of Mexico. What do you notice about it? Where is it?
Mississippi River Delta.
Just offshore the Mississippi River Delta. So all of the nutrients, everything that's washing down is creating it. And the current is going to be moving everything inland towards Texas because of how the circulation patterns help work in there. So that's why it kind of snakes around the side of Louisiana and sometimes a little further over to Texas. We have new construction noises today. Ocean trash is a huge concern with pollution. The trash in the ocean comes from land, yes. It also comes from ships, especially from cruise ships. One of the things that I would look for going on a cruise is what they do with their trash and their wastes. Because there are countries that regulate when cruise ships are registered in those countries. Because the cruise ships can be registered really in any country. Different companies must have a specific, usually place of business in a country for them to be registered there. It's worth checking to see where they're registered. Different countries have different things. The Norwegian cruise lines that are registered in European countries tend to dispose of trash correctly. Some of the other countries have no regulations for how cruise ships can dispose of their trash, so they dump it all while they're out to sea, which for me would be an ethical concern, knowing that I was going on a cruise ship where all of the trash would just be dumped randomly everywhere. But it's not just them. The trash from New York and New Jersey used to be sent offshore. There was a guy a number of years ago now, might be a good 25 years ago now, that was arrested in New Jersey. He was a dentist. He was taking his trash. He didn't want to pay for the removal of his biohazard trash from his practice. So he was taking it out on his boat and dumping it offshore. And all of his needles and other things were washing up and contaminating the beaches, which the fear then became that people would get hepatitis or HIV or other bloodborne pathogens from stepping on a needle that washed up on the shorelines. But he didn't want to pay for the biohazard disposal. Bad news for him is that eventually they were able to find something in there where they could trace it to a lot number, and then they could trace it through the company's database to figure out who had been shipped and delivered to. And that's how he was found guilty and went to jail, all sorts. I imagine he lost his dental license for lack of proper disposal. But it was a big fear, and it closed Jersey beaches, a couple of them, for a long period of time over a couple summers, because all of these needles keep washing up on the beach. Where are they coming from? Well, from Novocaine. Plastics, though, are our big concern. 1 million seabirds and 100,000 marine mammals and sea turtles die every year from plastics in the ocean. Most of them the tiny plastics. I purposefully do not have a picture of this. If you look, you can find one easily of when they do the necropsies of the young seabirds that have died. They usually find that they have stomachs full of plastic pieces because the parents are picking up things to feed them, and they pick them up and go, okay, well, this might be food, and it's not. And it poisons them, it kills them. But what it also does is the plastics don't move through the digestive tract, so they get stuck in the stomach, which leads to bloating of the stomach and an inability then to eat and absorb the nutrients from other things. So they're dying because they're full of plastic. Any of you ever buy 6-packs of soda or things that have the little rings on them? What do you do before you recycle them or throw them out? You cut through all the things? Sure. If you're going to recycle them and they're going to go through recycling bags, maybe you don't have to worry about that. But for the long time, we discovered that this is what was killing sea turtles and birds, is they would get caught in these 6-pack rings in the ocean and they would drown because they wouldn't be able to come back up to the surface and breathe. Or they get it around their neck and they might not be able to open the mouth and feed. And it was just little, I remember being in elementary school and we learned we had to cut them into pieces so that it didn't kill the animals in the ocean. But that's where education works for solving these concerns, is when people know we shouldn't do this because here's what happens, they go, okay, how do I fix that? And that's with pollution of water where we've been starting to fix things. Another thing we fixed is fishing lines. People used to just cut them off and leave them in the ocean. But then we started discovering that things were dying when they became entangled in them. And fishermen are realizing that they can't do this because it actually hurts their bottom line in the future. Coral reefs are a really big risk for ocean pollution. Not only are they near the coast, but they require clear water. So having sediment pollution for them is a massive concern. It gets on top of everything, and it can do away with sunlight, decrease the amount of oxygen coming onto the reef. They also need shallow water, and they need water of a specific pH. They also thrive in slightly cool water. So climate change, this is looking at the different types of pollution that are seen in ocean waters. Chesapeake Bay is our largest estuary in the United States. It is probably my second favorite estuary in the United States. Does anyone want to guess what my first favorite estuary is? Delaware Bay. Yep. I've studied both the Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware Bay considerably. Chesapeake is the largest. What are the 6 states that it's bordered by? Or that drain into it? Let's see if we can name them. Maryland. Pennsylvania. New Jersey. Not Virginia. Well, actually, yeah, Virginia. New York. Might be 7. Maybe not New Jersey. That's wrong. I don't think it is New Jersey. New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, Delaware. There's a portion of Delaware where there's a very high part, and half of it goes, well, most of the state ends up going into the Delaware, but a little bit goes into the Chesapeake. 9 large rivers feed into this estuary. 141 small streams. And between 1940 and 2010, it saw its population and its watersheds go from 3.7 million to 17 million. So that's 70 years, more than 4 times increased. This water body is very shallow. The bay is remarkably shallow, which means that there's sunlight getting to the bottom in a lot of areas, which increases productivity, which can cause problems because it's prone to harmful algal blooms and it's prone to eutrophication issues then, because there's a lot of farming all up and down these large rivers. There's also a lot of golf courses and a lot of housing developments with all of these people being built into the area. It has a really slow exchange rate with the ocean, with about 1% of the water in the estuary being replaced by ocean water every year. So it would take about 100 years to flush all of the water out with ocean water. Most estuaries have a much higher than that exchange rate. some of them on magnitudes of like 10 to 25, even higher percentages of exchange. The phosphate and the nitrate levels here are very large, are very high. They've resulted in sharp fisheries declines due to eutrophication problems, but also because of overfishing and overharvesting. At one point in time, it was said that the American shad that were in the Chesapeake were so plentiful that you could almost pick them out by hand. Can you imagine walking out into an estuary and literally being able to grab a fish by hand because there's so many of them? The oysters that are in the Chesapeake Bay numbered in probably the billions. And the number one way that the water was cleansed in the Chesapeake Bay was by these oyster populations. Oysters can clean water like nobody's business. They're constantly filtering through as filter feeders. And when we started over-harvesting the oysters, we started decreasing the bay's ability to handle its pollution levels and to cleanse itself. And phosphate and nitrate, not surprisingly, lead to algal blooms and low dissolved oxygen. Haha, not New Jersey, but everything else we got. It's huge. And check out the areas with low or no oxygen at some point in time during the year. Not constantly, but at some point in time during the year. Almost always at the height of summer. Can anybody identify this for me? Blue crabs. How do you catch a blue crab if you're going to pick them up? One way and one way only to make sure you don't get destroyed. From the back, you're going to pinch in with your thumb and your pointer finger and forefinger at the back, and you're going to grab it and hold it that way because it won't be able to move the front claws back to grab you otherwise. So in case you're ever faced in a situation where you've got to pick up blue crabs, you now know how to do that. Alternatively, you can kick them off the side of things relatively well, which is why you always wear closed-toed shoes on a boat, because in case something happens, you need to wear closed-toed shoes on a boat. How do you think we fixed, though, or started to fix the Chesapeake Bay? Phosphates were really high. What did we do? If nutrient levels are really high, what do you think we might do? We encouraged farmers to stop using as much fertilizer. We encouraged people to stop fertilizing their lawns. We planted trees all along the riparian corridors, so right next to rivers and things, because that way the trees and the plants could filter out the nutrients before they reach the water body. But we did one other remarkably important thing. We removed all phosphates from all detergents sold in this region. Quite a bit of the phosphate load was related to soaps and detergents. By making all of the soaps and detergents sold in this region phosphate-free, it meant they bubbled a little bit less. But it removed immediately a massive amount of phosphate going through the system, because it wasn't enough to just focus on the fertilizers, because the fertilizers were providing both nitrogen and phosphorus. And when phosphorus became overwhelming, it was clear that there was another source. Now, people complained. There was some backlash, and there's been these movements to bring back the phosphate in the detergents. But we don't need them. Do any of you use soap products that barely bubble at all, but you know that they clean? You might. There are some that don't. What bubbles is the surfactant, which is sort of a cleansing agent, but you can cleanse without surfactants too. And probably you all know that maybe you don't need to use always as much soap on things as you might think you do. I think we all learned that as a little kid when we were first washing the dishes and we're like, lots of soap. Too much soap. Or the first time you load the dishwasher or the washer and there's a disaster. Hopefully none of you have done that. I have not, but I know someone that loaded their dishwasher once with dishwashing detergent or with the dish soap and it went everywhere. But we remove phosphates. Some areas of the country still have phosphates in their detergents. We don't. Some of the companies are looking at bringing it back, but it's not necessary. And this was a really easy change that had massive impacts. Groundwater pollution deals with the infiltration of pollutants. We've talked about this, I think, already. The pollutants get into the soils, get into the sediment, and they drain down with the water towards the groundwater. One of the main sources of pollutants may be a leaky septic tank. All the water, all the nutrients as they leak, it can contaminate groundwater. It's not the nutrients that are the concern, it's the bacteria then that are in the septic tank that become the concerns also, a pollutant. Gas and oil tanks can leak when they're underground, leaching high carbon containing things into our groundwater and contaminating them with gas and oil. The waste ponds, the storage ponds for the animal manure. Groundwater does purify itself, but we've found that it does have a longer time for purification than surface waters do. So anyone want to think about why that might be? Which water moves faster? Surface water. So groundwater already moves slower. Which one has more exposure to oxygen and therefore more bacterial work in it? The surface water. So the groundwater, because of the decreased availability of oxygen, decreased bacterial ability, and the extra long time it takes to move anywhere, does take slightly longer to purify. In the end, it may be a lot cleaner, but it takes longer to get there. Groundwater pollution is really difficult to measure unless you have sensors in the ground that can sense it, but those are expensive to put in everywhere. We do have them where there's underground gas and oil storage tanks, but most of the time they're installed not because of the concerns for groundwater, but because of the concerns of how much money am I going to lose if my oil tank starts leaking, or at a gas station because their gas tank is leaking. The concern is detecting leaks to save money, which works for us because there's an environmental benefit. And I never want to complain, really, when there's an environmental benefit because we're saving money. And deep well injection is then a concern, as we've mentioned last time. This is looking at different types of groundwater contamination. One that I did not mention are when things are buried underground. When there's waste and things buried underground in a landfill situation, they can leach out into groundwater. They're supposed to have concrete linings and other things keeping them there, but if they don't, we can have bad situations. Towards the end of this semester, we're going to talk about Love Canal. Who's familiar with Love Canal? It's considered one of, if not one of the greatest environmental disasters in the United States. It's part of the reason why we got Superfund sites, and it's disturbing to think that it happened within your grandparents' time period. Probably within your grandparents' time period. If your parents are on the older side, it may have happened in their lifetime as well. And children were dying because there was leaking waste, leaking all into the playground, and when it rained, there were puddles of chemicals everywhere. But we're going to talk about that after we've talked about some other topics that come into play with it. So that's going to be a case study we use at the end. However, from it, we learned how to handle waste better. And we've made sure that that disaster won't happen again. So what do? How do we fix water pollution? What do you think? Hopefully you read some articles or watched some videos that talked about pollution. What did you learn from them? Did you learn anything about how to fix it? Who read the rubber ducky one? It didn't talk about how to fix pollution, did it?
No, it just said we use those types of events to study like the ocean currents in that example and to prevent it in the future.
So there was this large shipment of rubber duckies, and the ship went down. And the rubber duckies eventually got loose. And they tracked them all over the world and had people like telling them where they were found. And they used to figure out ocean current patterns. This is one of the few times where we've said, wow, a pollution event of rubber duckies and a crashing ship and all the other things has been great because we learned more about ocean currents from that than we ever could have potentially imagined. They now know, though, if there's another pollution event there, what will happen and where to concentrate the efforts. And sometimes that's what we're learning. How about microbeads? That was one of the other things. What do you think we can do about those little plastic microbeads and things?
Are they starting to ban those?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's the best way to handle it?
Sure. Seems like it'll be pretty effective, I guess.
So you're going with prevention as opposed to cleanup. How many of you think prevention is better than cleanup for this? Is prevention easier? It's a lot easier to regulate too, isn't it? Because whose fault is the pollution? Do we always know? Not at all. Most pollution, you learn there's two types, right? Point and non-point source. Almost all pollution is non-point source for the most part. And you can't hold any one person responsible for that. So regulation becomes easier than enforcement and cleanup. What else do you think we should do? Cleanup is cheaper. That sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? Part of it is because you can't clean up everything. Also, if I only have to clean up when there's an emergency situation, it's going to cost me less money. Prevention is going to require me to rethink how I do everything and to find something else to do with my waste and to make sure maybe I have to repump my plant or something. That's going to cost me more money. Cleanup is sometimes easier. Okay, instead of redoing how we transport oil, I'm just going to clean up this oil tanker spill. It's easier than replacing all of the tankers. But prevention is better for oil spills. Only 15% of oil spills can be recovered on average. So 85% of it we didn't get back, which is why the cleanup is cheaper, because you're only getting part of it. We have this new idea with oil spills that we're going to create bacteria that can metabolize the oil and that we will put them into areas of oil spill. Good idea? Well, first of all, we don't have any right now that thrive in salt water, and almost all of the oil spills happen in salt water. Second thing, we're concerned, what if they then become invasive? But another one is, what if other things then eat them and they still contain inside of them the toxic parts of the petroleum? Having said this, if they break down the oil, that will be better because 85% of it doesn't get broken down. Prevention requires regulations and standards. We can't clean groundwater. For drinking water, prevention is the best way to do it. We actually know that prevention is cheaper here, and it's better, and it's easier than cleanup. Anybody ever have a well that got contaminated? I have family friends who live in coastal Maryland, and their drinking wells became contaminated about a year and a half, 2 years ago. The Army Corps of Engineers was doing a big project where they live, and they made a mistake, and they contaminated the entire aquifer that their development draws their drinking water from with high levels of nutrients and with salt water and with other things. The Army Corps had to pay for all of the houses to be hooked up to the public water supply and had to supply them with bottled water for all cooking and drinking and food washing requirements for quite some time until the public water was brought up because they could not clean up the aquifer at all. How many of you watch the shows on television that like to have like these very strange plot lines where it's like, we're going to save the world, and every so often something pops up where it's like, they're going to contaminate our water supply? Or like movies that talk about this, because that's what everyone's afraid of. You can't clean up an entire contaminated water supply. It's also really difficult to contaminate an entire water supply easily. Control and prevention are perhaps best. One of the easiest ways to clean things up is just to plant trees near where water is, because trees will help clean it. How about toxic organic chemicals? How do you think we can clean them up? Or prevent them? We don't use DDT anymore, do we? So we've regulated it out. Some companies will willingly try to phase out things that they know are poisonous. The 3M company has actually done a really good job at phasing in more sustainable policies to their work, because in the long run, they've discovered it does save them money, but really their short-term reasons have a lot to do with being a better company who cares about people's health. It seems kind of silly to think about the people who make Scotch tape as making decisions that are better. But they also make the chem wipes and all sorts of other things. Preventative measures are necessary for toxic organic chemicals. At one point in time, the way that we dealt with them is when a company had them and they couldn't release them to the water system, they were allowed to build a pond and evaporate out the water, and then take the toxic sludge waste that was left at the end and put that in a dump. Does that sound bad to you? We got rid of those entirely. One storm comes by and all of that is in your water system. You can no longer ban a lot of waste, or we've banned a lot of waste burial in landfills because barrels leak. Companies have been forced to make substitutions with non-hazardous materials when possible. Elimination of waste is the best way to handle this. It's cheaper, it's easier, it's more healthy, it's better for the health of your workers, and consumers tend to like it more. I apologize to the guys, this probably question won't matter much to you, but and maybe it will for skincare products, shampoo, cosmetics. Does anybody look at whether or not their products are safe when they buy them? Sarah, I'm pretty sure you worry about whether or not it's Leaping Bunny certified and cruelty-free. Does it make you feel healthier to know that the things you're using are better? So think about it, it's a consumer mentality too. Consumers want things that don't contain toxic chemicals. They say that the average woman or man who wears lipstick eats about 7 pounds of lipstick in their lifetime. Lipstick contains lead in a lot of the ones that are made and sold. That's bad. It contains trace amounts of lead. A lot of the ones that are certified though as organic or as natural or as things may not contain the lead. It's worth looking into. But 7 pounds of lipstick is a disgusting figure to think about consuming. Elizabeth?
I thought people look down on products made with any sort of lead.
Yeah, they do, right?
That was why a lot of toys, I know
Yes,
children's toys.
yes, but it's not been phased out of lipstick. It's been phased out of paint and children's toys, but not lipstick. Because no one talks about it being in your lipstick.
So we applied that directly to our faces.
I know! And the odds are much higher you're going to eat that than they are that you're going to eat a lead toy. I hope. But yes, it's a trace amount, but it's still there. Eutrophication. Both cleanup and prevention are useful here. We've discovered that one of the best ways to handle this is once the algae is there in large quantities, take it out. Use a net. Use like a water vacuum. Use anything to pull it out so that it doesn't get the opportunity to decay and use up all the dissolved oxygen. One of the things that's a little controversial is when you have an algal bloom, you should spray it with herbicides. I'm seeing a lot of no. Why are we saying no?
Because it could kill other plants.
Yes. And
Worms.
fish and macroinvertebrates and other things. So we're all going no with the spraying of herbicides on one? What if it's like an environmentally friendly herbicide?
Still gonna kill everything.
It's still going to kill some things, and is there really an environmentally friendly anything side?
Unless it specifically targets that. I don't know if that's
Right? One of the other controversial ones, but I like this one, is pumping air and installing, when you see ponds that have those big fountains, not only do they look pretty, but they help oxygenate the water. By having the water constantly turning over, it's putting more oxygen into the system. So even if you then did have a large algal bloom, the water is not stagnant. There's something moving it around and bringing more oxygen in, thereby decreasing the chance that things are going to, we still do call it drowned, effectively.
Why
Prevention.
is that controversial?
Well, because you're altering the ecosystem, or because it requires power to do it, or because, well, maybe some things in the pond like the still water. So there's this concern that it's messing with nature, that it's an additional step of human intervention. But for me, a step of intervention that can fix something we've caused is good. For other people, it may not be. Do we all agree that a step of intervention that fixes things is better? And then prevention, laws and monitoring. Sure, we do this. There's ideas that we can have better technologies for delivering nutrients to things, that we can remove the phosphates from our detergents, that we can somehow change the way we use fertilizers. But there's a big concern about decreasing our fertilizer use. Even organic farming requires fertilizers. If we use much less fertilizer on our agricultural fields, and that decreases the food availability, is that good?
We could waste less food. I don't think it would be as much of a
Okay.
problem.
So if we couple less fertilizer with less food waste, maybe it won't be a problem. Because you are right that we have enough, we currently make enough food, but much of it spoils to feed everybody. But it doesn't get that far.
Is it possible to, like, is the problem using fertilizer in general, or that there's a lot of runoff? Like, what if
That's the big
it
problem.
could be, like, used, but less runoff?
Yeah, we need to decrease the runoff of it. And once again, the problem isn't necessarily farms. That's what we all think about. In Lancaster County, when I was an undergrad, my professors that were studying this found that the local golf courses, and for that matter, most people's farms or lawns that they fertilized, were producing more runoff of fertilizer than were your farms.
That makes me very upset.
One of my professors presented it this way, and it's the way I talk about it too, because it makes sense to me. How many of you know farmers? Are they fairly thrifty people? Do they waste money on fertilizer? They're only going to put on what their fields need. There are also people that are deeply connected to their land when it's a family farm. And the difference is that in Lancaster County, there's not a lot of factory farms. There's a lot of family farms. The large industrial farms may be run differently. But your small farmers aren't going to have the money to put on lots more fertilizer than they need. They're going to watch the weather. They are never going to put down a layer of fertilizer knowing it's going to rain 1.5 inches the next day because they've just wasted everything. Whereas the lawn care services, if it rains right after they've put whatever all over your lawn, they'll come back 3 days later because it's in the contract and they'll do it again. The golf courses need to be green. Cody's saying yes.
Like all of them.
People would think they do.
Right?
Yeah.
How about they're all AstroTurf instead? Which is permeable for groundwater recharge.
I don't know why.
Just get rid of golf.
Okay. Or some of the golf courses, at least. How many are around here?
Too many.
I worked at a golf course last summer, and they would paint the grass when it was too brown.
I love it.
Really? Yeah.
That's hilarious.
They
I
drop
love
in,
it.
Like, the tee boxes with green spray paint. You gotta be kidding me. There's like creeks right beside like all the holes, so like it just.
Fertilizer doesn't last then, right?
No, it's terrible. 'Cause the
That-
grass is like a quarter of an inch, so it's not holding any like water anyway.
We
It
talked
runs
about-
right off.
What length your grasses should be, right? And you remember what I said it was?
You love
1.5 to 2 inches is optimal for nutrient usage and grass growth. But no one wants their lawn this tall, right? Everybody wants it down here. One of my professors at Millersville did a study on it. He convinced the university, and I don't think anyone would allow us to do this here, to have a large area on like one side of campus where almost no one walked. So like imagine Bidone. As plots, and he would fertilize different ones, and he had like a lawnmower for like research purposes, and he would mow them to different heights, and then he would like sample the grass and look to see how things were going. And he was like, it's remarkable the difference in health when the grass is a little bit taller, because part of it is there's more healthy plant growing, more roots, the sediment stays, the fertilizer stays, and it's good.
I just have very little patience for things like aesthetic things that we like golf courses and lawns. Like there's so many other things I understand why people don't want to change because it helps. Like they're gonna lose money or this or that, but like this,
I'm with you.
I don't get it.
How many of you feel the same way? But how many of us golf? Yeah. I don't know if it would matter if we golfed or not.
I don't know. Maybe I just don't understand the values.
But then again, there are a lot of other people that wouldn't see the beauty in where you see the beauty. And that's perhaps where the problem is. Because you see that there is beauty in wild land area. That it doesn't just have to be pretty flowers with my front lawn. And when you see a lawn, do you see an ecosystem? That's part of the other problem, is we value an ecosystem that is healthy, that has a variety of things, that has lots of different things all growing together, not just a monoculture of grass. And getting people to see value in that is really hard. There's lots of healthier grasses that we can use in a lot of places other than the ones that are perennially green. There's a lot of things that are shades of brown that are grass. A lot of the crabgrasses and things can grow well in drought areas. They're not pretty green colors. They don't have these nice uniform pieces of grass. But they're healthy. And they have a different type of soil biota than do the others. Do you think maybe that's one of the main things we need to do to solve a lot of environmental problems? Is get people over the idea of what I think is pretty is good, and convince them that wild things are good and that we need to move outside of our comfort zone? Because that would solve food. I think we checked this, and who was going to eat cricket flour? A couple people. If you didn't know it was cricket flour, you'd eat the pancakes made with cricket flour and the bread. Yeah. I think every year Dr. Dubay teaches entomology. He jokes about making them eat bugs. I don't think he's ever made them eat bugs.
He always says he'll like offer extra credit, and then he never does, even if you do. That's why.
So I think it was to go to like this thing, the Franklin Institute during the summer.
Oh, yes.
He's
They
like,
did have that,
"You
like,
here, you will eat the bugs." I'm
Food
like,
with
"No,
bugs
no, no."
thing.
You want the candy that you always see bugs in it? I do that stuff.
I'm with you. Every time I watch The Amazing Race and they're eating like bugs, I'm like, or like Fear Factor when that used to be on, there was always a food challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Sediment pollution. Well, we should use sustainable agricultural methods. We should make sure that our construction sites are well managed so that we don't have sediment pollution. I'm not sure what I meant by more. Oh, it's more cost effective to keep the sediment from eroding in the first place than it is to replace it, because it's expensive to get good topsoil. One of the things with construction sites is maybe we shouldn't build houses where areas are prone to erosion or where the soil is good for growing food. We should grow food and not houses in those areas. It's better for everything. Then how do we deal with it once the sediment pollution has started? I mentioned those retention basins that usually have a marsh around them on a construction site so that all of the water goes through the swales into these areas. They also may have sedimentation ponds that don't really have a pond all the time, but are where they direct sediment so that it falls out. We dredge areas that become trapped or entrapped in sediments. So we pull the sediments up and out to make our rivers deeper. And one of the things we are doing that's a little strange is we use chemicals to coagulate clay particles to get them to stick together so that they will filter out, or we then take that and we mix it with a sand filter so that as the water goes through, just the water comes out at the end and all of the sediment is filtered out. Because clay particles don't want to stick to each other or to anything else really without other chemical measures in place. So this keeps them from being constantly suspended and giving the water that dirty look. You know how the water sometimes looks like slightly brown and you don't really see anything? It's the clay usually that's causing that. When it looks cloudy brown. When it looks like tea, it's tannins from plants and that's fine. But when it looks like a cloudy white-brown color, it's the clay particles. We do have the U.S. Clean Water Act and all of the amendments about how we deal with chemical pollutants. And this did establish permissible pollutant levels. And that's as far as we will go with this. If you take environmental regulation and policy, we'll spend, I don't know, a couple weeks on the Clean Water Act. We have the U.S. Safe Drinking Water Act that set levels for what could be in your drinking water. Nitrates are one thing it sets a level for because nitrates in water leads to blue baby disease in children that the nitrates can actually, high levels of nitrates can kill infants. Oil has national and international laws. For us, it was the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. But all of these things basically deal with point source pollution. Non-point source solution is almost impossible to legislate. We also use technology. Oil spills, we physically use vacuums to suction it up. We use dispersants, which will keep the oil from coagulating in a single area to spread it out, which seems counterintuitive, but it means that it reduces the pollution load on any one small area. And it means the organisms are less likely to be killed outright from being caught in it. We're trying to use decomposition by bacteria, and we're burning oil spills when they happen. We set the water literally on fire to burn off the oil. It's effective. And, you know, you can then put out the fire pretty easily because it's on water. It will burn itself out. This only works if you're a distance from land. Keep that in mind, otherwise the fire continues. And that's bad. We talked about using fertilizers better. Sediment we've talked about too, how to fix that. This was mentioned already in one of the other lectures, but this is looking again at how we do agriculture with sediment. We have the terracing, the contour planting, the alley cropping, and the windbreaks. They fix sediment pollution. They also fix water pollution. And they keep sediment there. The only one I didn't mention is there's been suggestions to tax lawn and garden fertilizers at a lot higher so that people will buy less of them and therefore use them less. And the riparian buffers are those buffers that are right along the stream where we plant vegetation. We will go over sewage treatment at the sewage treatment plant. But this is it, and you can read about it in your textbook, the idea versus primary versus secondary versus tertiary. But when we go visit a sewage treatment plant, we will see what those look like. Lastly, I think this is the last slide in a minute. We need to protect ourselves from pathogens in the water. The main way that we test for bacterial pathogen load is by doing a coliform bacteria test. It doesn't test everything, but it gives a good idea of the bacterial load. And we do that by taking a water sample, rubbing it on a plate, and then letting it sit for a few days in the dark and coming back to look to see if there's bacterial colonies on it. We've discovered sewage treatment is necessary to have good, clean drinking water. And we also manage watersheds now as large groups as opposed to single streams. We found that by managing the land and the water together, people are able to understand the connections more, and it allows us to effectively make changes that we could not otherwise make. You find things like this or like this in areas where the water goes directly out to the coast. This is true of storm sewers. It's why you don't want to dump things in your storm sewer. And surprisingly, a lot of the work we've done to fix water pollution has made a big difference. This is something where we are winning. Is there still water pollution? Yes. But it's much less now than it was when you were born. And it's by far much less now than it was in the 1940s and 50s. And at least we're aware of it and checking it. So if you're looking for a thing where I'm like, we're actually winning, we are. And I'll use the Delaware Bay as a case study later in the semester. I'll use both it and Love Canal. At one point in time, it was forecasted that the Delaware Bay would never be fishable water, drinkable water, or water you could swim in. That's not only not true, but the strides we've made to make it cleaner made it better than it was even in the 1950s today. So it works.